All right. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 here is going to be the last section we cover. This is sort of just an introduction to graphing section. One of the things that'll happen, this is sort of more pre-algebra stuff to a certain extent, but it's also sort of generically applicable and just sort of good to know. It can happen in life, in math, from time to time that you want to have a visual representation of something. And so, an equation or some sort of a relationship. And what will happen is you'll often end up using what we call the rectangular coordinate system. So section 9.1 is about this, the rectangular coordinate system. This is sometimes referred to as the XY plane, which is actually probably the terminology I'll use a lot of the time. And the idea behind this is it's just a tool to sort of represent different relationships in two dimensions, right? So really what it is like two number lines that have been essentially superimposed over top of each other. So you have kind of your standard like left-right number line, and that's going to be what we call the x-axis. So we can kind of mark the x values here. So kind of mark it with a little bit of an X. So this is what we would call the x-axis. So this is literally just a number line, right? And so you have positive x values here, and you have negative x values here, and it's sort of 0 in the center. So all of your positive numbers are to the right, and they're getting bigger and bigger the further you go. Your negative values are to the left, and they're, of course, getting sort of bigger and bigger, but negative, right? -5, -10, -15, and so on as you go further and further to the left. This is then kind of, right, crossed with what we'll call the y-axis. So that's the vertical axis. So the x is sort of a horizontal number line. The y-axis, again, it's just numbers. But now it's vertical. And so you've created, by sort of crossing this sort of x and y axis, you get this sort of two-dimensional space that's sort of broken up into 4 quadrants. The y values will be from center if you go down, will be negative. If you go up, you will get bigger and bigger positive values. So this kind of breaks this into 4 sort of different regions, what we call 4 quadrants. And what happens here, the way that we would identify sort of an individual point, this is what we're going to call an ordered pair. And it's going to be sort of in parentheses the x value and then the y value. So the way this works, to be able to sort of tell somebody and sort of communicate just like where you are in this plane, this two-dimensional system, is you give an x coordinate and a y coordinate. You can think of this, on a map or something. It sort of is the same idea of moving, north, south, east, or west, right? You can kind of move in one of those 4 directions. We don't need 4 things, because what happens is you have, so like east would be a positive x value and west would be a negative x value. Moving north would be kind of a positive, right, y value, and moving south would be a negative y value. So between having an x and a y and then having either of those be positive or negative, you sort of in theory get all 4 of your directions, and so then your coordinates are a combination of those 2. And the way this works, the thing that's most important is when you get one of these pairs, it's always the x value first and then the y value. So it's always x comma y. So your movements are always going to be sort of either to the right for a positive or to the left for a negative first. And then you're going to move either sort of up or down depending on if your second value, your y value, is positive or negative. Let me break this down into quadrants, and then of course we'll practice just identifying these points and sort of what it looks like. Initially, the first quadrant, quadrant number 1, is up here in the upper right, so in sort of the northeastern quadrant to a certain extent, if you want to think of this in terms of north, south, east, and west as sort of a reference. The XY coordinates here, what you have are positive X values, right? Because you're sort of to the right of center. So your X values are positive, and the Y values are also positive because you're sort of above the horizontal axis, right? You're in the upper, the upper half of the map. So sort of up and to the right, this sort of northeastern quadrant are where your X and Y values are both positives. If you ever see like different, visualizations in sort of a business context or something, right? Or anywhere, bar graphs, line graphs, things like that. If you ever look at like stock prices or something, if you're watching the news, and you sort of see them go up or down, or you're looking at like oil prices, or you're, looking at kind of lots of different visualizations. A lot of the times what you'll see is actually just this first quadrant, in as much as if you're looking at information that is only giving you positive values, right? If you're looking at, some information over a certain number of days, so maybe it's like, right, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 30 days, you're looking at information over a month, and then you're looking at, the cost of something maybe. So it's for gas, it's $2.50, it's $2.47, it's $2.60, it's $2.55, kind of going up and down, right? All of those values would be positive. And so a lot of times if you see those kind of graphs and those kind of visuals, what it really is it's sort of just that upper right quadrant, right? Where you just have positive values and kind of both of your axes, right? In terms of like number of days, positive days, right? And then, price or something. You could expand it out sort of all of these quadrants if you have something where your variables, your values are spitting out both positives or negatives. You'll need sort of a bigger thing. To move through the quadrants, what we do next is we go counterclockwise, as we sort of rotate counterclockwise around. So quadrant 2 is going to be here in the upper left. And what changes from quadrant 1 to quadrant 2 is that your X values, right? So now that you're left of center, your X values are negative. The Y values are still positive because you're sort of right above the center line. So that means your sort of XY values would be a negative value and then a positive value. So if you're looking at just the sort of the sign of things to help figure out what your orientation should be in which quadrant, that's going to be what you look for. So a negative and then a positive, right, would be kind of a move to the left and then a move up. That would be what you have. Let's do these last two. So quadrant 3 would be here. If we sort of continue that rotation. Once we hit quadrant 3, so this is sort of now the bottom left quadrant. This would be kind of like a southwest quadrant. The X values were still to the left of center, so the X values are still negative. But now we've also dipped underneath the sort of horizon, right, underneath this horizontal axis. So the Y values are also negative. So in that quadrant 3, you essentially have sort of double negative coordinates, a negative X and a negative Y. If we complete our rotations around here to quadrant 4, what happens now is we've shifted to the right of center. So we did kind of 2 quadrants to the left, and now we're coming back around to the right-hand side. So the X values come back around to the positives. We're still under the horizon, right? So we're still sort of, south of the middle. So our Y values will still be negative. So quadrant 4 is going to be a positive X and then a negative Y. And then, of course, if you keep rotating, you'll come back up to quadrant 1 and you're good to go. You're back at double positives. So that's kind of the basic layout of this rectangular system. What we're going to do next is so plot some points and be able to kind of ID different points from the graphs. So I'm going to pause this video here. That's the sort of layout. That's kind of the lay of the land. So we'll look at some coordinates here in the next video.